Welcome everybody this morning. It's not too often that I get to say welcome to a Watershed event, but I'm really glad to be able to say that this morning. As Chris mentioned, I'm from Chautauqua County. You might have to close one eye a little bit and look at my visuals a little differently, but really when I talk about watershed management, I'm talking about principles and concepts that can be applied from Chautauqua County up to the Adirondacks, down to Long Island, across the country, with some exceptions. So stick with me on that. Watersheds are not terribly complex places, and I don't have a lot of handouts for you, but I have three terms I really want you to keep in mind, not just when I'm talking or when the other presenters are talking, but when you leave this room. Most importantly, when you leave this room, these three words are words that I hope will stick with you, and I'll explain them as we go along. Well, who cares about this stuff, right? You all do. That's cool. Mr. Griffin cares. That was a very compelling presentation. I hadn't seen that before. That was a huge, enormous flood event. My jaw was just, dropping in the background. But a lot of our flooding, a lot of our storms are not those huge, huge events. A lot of our floods are smaller events, or what they seem to be turning into is more frequent events, and also a little larger and more localized. So we need to really think about that. Why might you care? Lots of reasons. I don't think I need to spend more time on that one. Interesting to me as we start developing the upper parts of our watersheds. As we start developing the upper parts of our watersheds, people like to move water around. And it's not too long, it seems, that landowner A puts water on landowner B, and landowner B picks up the phone and calls either the town supervisor, the highway superintendent, one of your municipal officials, and says, what are you going to do about this? Well, it's private property, right? But water is a public resource that flows through private lands. So there is actually a relationship, but you might get calls. So just be aware of that. Groundwater is typically related to our surface water. You know why this is happening? Okay. All right. Stick with me. Groundwater, surface water relationship. I don't know about this part of the state. I know in my part of the state, a lot of especially the rural landowners, but many of the municipalities use groundwater as a source of drinking water. Understanding that there's a relationship between that water below the surface and what's going on top. If we lose that water on top, we're probably going to be losing some of that water below. So that's a really important resource for us. Jobs and quality of life issues. These are not things that you might typically think about related to water, but in fact, in my opinion, they are. California is a great example of people really under stress right now because they don't have enough water. We have a lot of industries. I'm standing here in the middle of wine country. We have a lot of industries that rely on good, quality, plentiful water. Huge impact to the economy of New York State. When employers are looking where to site their facilities, they may sometimes look for places that have that abundant resource, that high quality resource. They might also look at it from a recreational aspect as a way to draw employees into an area. We could go on with a whole list, but I know for many of you sitting in the room today, municipal cost is a huge consideration. And in contrast to Steve's presentation, think about these municipal costs as little small incremental costs that you have to absorb day after day after day, week after week, month after month, and year after year. And I think you will come to appreciate this is really significant, even if it's just a little bit every time. So we've used the term, I've used the term. It was not in Mr. Griffin's presentation, which I thought was interesting. But what is a watershed? Let's all get on the same page here. Do you want to make adjustments, or I can just use that?
Try this instead, but let's try this off first. So,
okay, I'm going to take this off. All right. Now we'll see if I can do two things at once. Okay. This is a tough gig, I'll tell you. All right, so a watershed, in my opinion, behaves a lot like a funnel. The top of the funnel in a watershed context is something called a ridge line, and I've indicated on this block diagram of a watershed where this ridge line is. The ridgeline just separates one watershed from another. And watersheds exist at different scales. We don't need to get real technical here today, but you're basically talking about a dividing line so that everything that falls or moves, either on the surface or subsurface, within this watershed is going to flow out this point, otherwise known as the mouth of the watershed. So there's your first homework assignment, is the funnel. When you go back out of here and you start driving around, think about this concept. Everything above that drainage point is going to contribute in one way or another to material moving to the bottom of that watershed. So of course we get a little precipitation in New York, usually in the form of rain or snow. What happens when we get that precip? Well, on the natural landscape, it might flow in something called a tributary. These are just smaller streams that flow into larger streams, or maybe they flow into a lake, as we were just discussing. They might be stored in a wetland, which I'll talk about in a little while. They might also infiltrate into the soil and move slowly down towards the stream. The bottom is where we get our runoff. This is the water that has not soaked in, or the combination of the water that has soaked in and that which has not soaked in. Well, I guess we know that didn't come from the other mic. And it didn't come from me, all right? Okay, so watersheds are complex enough, even though they're fairly simple in that everything flows downhill, without adding people in. But the fact of the matter is, we've had people in our watersheds for a long, long time. And most of our watersheds, I love that question at the end of Mr. Griffin's presentation about impervious surface and all this other stuff, because most of what we've done in our watersheds has been to speed it up. And it's not because we did it intentionally, but we have a lot of different land uses that we partake of here in Western New York. Forestry, industry, towns, villages, cities, whatever. Agriculture of various different types, various parts of the state. So we have a lot of stuff going on the landscape. And it's been here for a long time. We're just adding to it. So let me ask you this question as we move into the presentation. In your municipality, if I go down your roster, do you have somebody that's in charge of watershed management? I know you have a highway superintendent. I know you have a town supervisor. I know that you have maybe your planning board of one. Who's in charge of watershed management? Where I'm from in Chautauqua County, very few municipalities have anybody that even know what the word watershed means. And I mean no disrespect to them, because we really haven't had that exchange with them. So think about this for your own municipality. Now I'm going to take you on a little trip to Western New York, but again, just close one eye and think about where you live, where your municipality is, and who your neighbors are. This is the Conowongo Creek watershed. We're over in far western New York. Conowongo Creek watershed actually is within 3 different counties. We have Chautauqua County over here, Cattaraugus County just east of it, and then all of that flows south into Warren County. So right away we begin to see that watersheds really do not respect our political boundaries all that much. And if we're going to be doing watershed management, it's going to be essential that we start reaching across these political lines that mean nothing in terms of the way water flows and start meeting the people on the other side of the line. I guess I just get a little too excited sometimes. Now, Conowongo Creek is actually kind of interesting because not only is it the area lie within 3 counties, but also 2 states. So we have an interstate watershed. Just emphasizing that point a little bit more. I don't have them all drawn, but there are 27 municipalities within the Conowongo Creek watershed. It's about 900 square miles, thousands of landowners, right? So thinking about watershed management, thinking about that question at the end of the last presentation about impervious surface, where is that? How much land do you as a municipality own? Where is most of the land in your watershed? It's in private ownership. So we need to start working not only with other municipalities, but with landowners. And they need to start to understand some of the challenges that you folks are facing and that we're facing. Okay? This ought to wake you up. This is a hypothetical watershed. It's the stream network. In that first diagram, I showed you the ridge line. The ridge line is where the red meets the white in this watershed. Everything from the ridge on down, you can see, gets progressively bigger. These little green fingers flow together. They get blue. They keep coming together, they get bluer and bluer, and eventually here's the mouth of this particular watershed. Now I'm going to be referring to this in the next several slides, but it's going to be a lot smaller. So just take a look at it for just a second. Get an idea of what that network looks like. If you're used to dealing with municipal boundaries, if you're used to dealing with those boundaries, and you're not used to thinking about this kind of a boundary, I think we're going to have a change in the guard here.
We're going to transfer you mics.
All right, excellent. Anybody else bring a mic? If you're not used to thinking of this concept, it's just a little bit of a mind twister. But it's really not that hard either. It's the funnel, okay? So we're looking at the funnel. So I'm going to talk about some of the factors that influence what comes out of our watersheds. And I'm talking, when I'm using that terminology, I want you to think and understand that I'm talking about both the volume or how much water, as well as what is in that water. They're related. And I'm going to talk about, first, some of the upland watershed factors. Because when we're standing at our stream bank that has deteriorated, or our road that has washed out, we typically think we need to fix right here. But the fact of the matter is, if we think about that funnel concept, probably right here has a watershed area associated with it. And so at least we need to be looking uphill from us. So the first three, watershed size and shape, precipitation, and geology. I have color coded because we have no control over these things. We got what we got. Mr. Griffin gave us just a glaring example of what happens when precipitation goes bad. But you know that not all of our storm events are these giant, monstrous storms that he described. Many of our storm events are smaller events. A lot of the folks that I have been working with over the last 10 years, a lot of the folks from the soil and water districts, whom I want to give a plug right now, if you do not know and do not work with your soil and water districts, it's time to change that, because they know a whole lot about your watershed and they can help you. So I gave them their plug. But those guys, I've been talking to them for the last 10 years, and they said, you know what? We don't necessarily have the numbers on this, but the storms seem to be getting more localized and more intense, and they're giving us more problems. So we don't necessarily need that huge biblical storm that Mr. Griffin talked about to give us a headache. The geology. As you move west to east in New York State, my understanding is we go from really lousy geology over where I am, and by that I mean that it's very erodible. Once it starts to go, it will go and go and go. You get a little more competent as you move east in the state, as far as I understand. Watershed size and shape you have no control of. How big is that funnel? Some watersheds are small. They tend to be real flashy. Others are quite large. Maybe they can absorb that water for a while. Those other factors, soils, vegetation, land use, impervious cover, groundwater storage, I'm going to talk about all of those. But as I move on, consider that all of these things act somewhat like the link, the individual link in a collective group of links in a chain. So you start tugging on one of those things, you probably are going to be moving that chain around. You may not realize it, and it may not move far, but you tug it enough over a period of time, and you might see some substantial changes. So the first three I've lumped together, soils, vegetation, and land use. And the reason I put them together is because when you think about it, land use typically starts with affecting, typically starts with affecting vegetation, and vegetation grows on our surface soils. So we oftentimes have the potential to affect those soils and the vegetation by changes in land use. And let's just talk about a few that we have in New York State. We have maybe forestry or timber harvest. Agriculture is a huge piece of our economy, whether it's corn or grapes. We have rural home development starting to happen more and more in most municipalities, I believe. Suburban home development has been with us for quite some time. Again, back to that impervious area question. Urbanization or suburbanization, that has a certain look to it in most places. And resort development. I'm just giving you a few examples just to kind of get you thinking. I don't mean to imply by any of these examples that these are good or bad things to do. This is not a judgment call. It's more a science call. Hydrologically, these changes will impose some certain hydrologic change in the way that water moves in our watersheds. That's just the way it works. And it's largely due to that concept of impervious surface. There's one other thing, though, I want to talk about with soils, and this is kind of interesting. This is some work that was done in Ocean County, New Jersey. The Soil and Water District in Ocean County, New Jersey wanted to characterize how much water is moved into their soils in different types of land uses. So I'm sure you can all see it, but the undisturbed woods, they were able to absorb about 15 inches in an hour into those soils. They didn't have a lot of other impacts there. So it could hold a lot of water, which I've symbolized with a sponge. As they moved to a pasture, they had some grazing, they had some changes in those surface soils. You can see they lost about a third of their storage. They were down to 10. Single house, we lost some more. Now we're down to 7. And I'm generalizing here. I wouldn't expect that these numbers would necessarily hold where we are standing here today, but the relationships are what's important. By the time they got to the subdivision lawn, they were less than ½ an inch. Significant changes in the way water moves. So here's the rest of your homework assignment. As we go out there in the world, what have we done? Have we put a lot of sponges on the landscape, or have we put a lot of slides on the landscape? Think about that. But don't just think about it here. Think about it when you leave. By the way, when we consider these things, right, we all have our own little hunk of heaven. But at the watershed scale, when it really matters, we've got to add this all up together within the watershed area, because that's how the watershed sees those impacts. So consider that we all have individual actions, but there is a watershed response to the collection of individual actions. We typically think of impervious cover, or those surfaces that water cannot get into, associated with our urban or urbanizing areas, right? They're great culprits for that because we have wide streets, we have parking lots and buildings and all that good stuff. And then, of course, we have a storm system to take it away, like Calgon. However, the fact of the matter is we have impervious cover throughout our watersheds. It might be the conversion of farmland to a rural residential house, right? And we have a lot of that going on. It might be the resort development where we have these great hillsides, as I drove in yesterday and saw, wow, these are some steep hills. We're putting house on top of house on top of house on top of house. Nothing wrong with that. Again, not a judgment call. But when we think about the funnel, what are we doing? We're essentially paving or making the funnel more and more impervious with each of those houses. My house does the same thing. I'm not immune to that. Groundwater is a really important resource for us, as I indicated earlier, as I talked about. This is a large forested wetland that gives a lot of groundwater storage. So a big sponge. This is a smaller forested wetland. You can't really see the size of it, but you can see the land use has been changed. So we've got water pouring out of the wetland across the landscape surface onto something that is clearly impervious. You're not going to get water into that. It's headed right for the storm drain. So we have the potential to store that groundwater or to run that groundwater off. But where does our groundwater live? How much groundwater do you have on your municipal properties? You got some. But most of these features are things that are throughout our watershed. So again, working not only with your adjacent municipalities, but also with your private landowners to say, you know what, we really need to keep these functional parts of the landscape functional. Otherwise, we end up, and I really don't want to use Steve's example. It was a very good example, but it was hopefully a 1 in 1,000. But you know that we get these smaller floods that are eating our lunch every day. And I deal with a lot of people from municipalities that say, you know, we still get big storms, but it doesn't have to be the huge monster that's going to kill us. So groundwater storage, very important. As I transition to things that are closer to the stream, I want to just come back to this concept of municipal cost. I don't know where this is. I stole the slide. I imagine this might be a highway superintendent wondering how many truckloads of money he's going to need to fill this hole, this bump in the road, as it were. But I don't know, maybe he's the ambulance driver wondering how he's going to move from this side to help grandma get to the hospital. I mean, these are big significant deals. Typically, when we stand here and we look at a situation like this, and I hope you can see it, there's a little purple dot on my map, right there. And it looks like my map got cut off a little bit, my diagram. When we stand and we look at this, for good reasons sometimes, this is the only place we think we can work. I want to point out that there's a watershed area associated with that dot on the map, or on the diagram. And so really to address this in a meaningful way, you might have to move uphill, and you might have to start talking to the landowners and looking what's going on upstream of you, because that's what's leading into your funnel point right here where your problem is. So it's a little different way of looking at the world. You obviously as a municipality can't just go working on everybody's property helter-skelter, but if you can corral people together to say these things are important to us as a community because they cost us money, you can start to address some of these things. It's probably not going to happen overnight, and we'll have our share of challenges along the way. So I'm going to move a little closer to the stream. I'm going to talk about some stream characteristics, riparian function, floodplains, what I call watershed plumbing, and then just considering changes in time and space. And again, these things are in a relationship not only to each other, but to the things we just talked about. So let's start with channel characteristics. What I'm showing you here are two headwater stream channels. These are the green lines on the diagram, the ones that look like the bloodshot veins, but they're green. Well, it turns out that in most watersheds, approximately 80% of the stream channels are these headwater streams. That's important, and this came up in the previous presentation. That's important because these tend to be source areas for sediment and debris. It's the stuff that you have to deal with at the bottom of the hill. Now I'm giving you a tale of two stream channels here. On the left side you can see this one. I'm going to call it fairly functional. I'm not going to call it good or bad. I'm going to say it's functional because it doesn't look like this one. But more specifically because these stream banks seem like they must hold together pretty well year after year after year, or they would look different. So if we start reading the landscape a little bit, we can get some clues as to how it's behaving. This one, by the way, we're looking downstream. This one we're actually looking upstream. And in fact, right here is a culvert. Now I look at this and I ask myself, what's going on here? Was the culvert sized wrong when it was put in back in 1976? Did the watershed area change above? Did they get Steve's storm or just shy of it and it didn't take the culvert out? I don't know. This is a guardrail back here, so I don't know what the answer is, but what I do know is that sediment and debris are missing here. They're gone. And I do know that this acts as a funnel. So if there's more water moving through that funnel than it was designed to carry for whatever reason, it probably contributed to this loss of sediment and debris that we see here. And I don't know where it is now. But eventually I know it will work its way down the system. And I'm skipping some streams in between, some intermediate streams. Eventually we get down to our streams in our larger valley bottoms. And they tend to kind of move around, what's called meandering. A lot of times historically when we wanted to straighten those, we wanted to build over here. Turns out we actually added some energy to the system by doing that. These stream channels, because they're relatively large and flat, that sediment and debris that we've generated in the upper part of the watershed is likely to be a problem down here. This is where it's processed. A lot of times it will fall out, it will deposit, and it will start moving the stream around on itself. The stream will start cutting in response to these deposition areas of sediment and debris. If you have infrastructure there, if you have bridges, if you have culverts, those kinds of things, this can be problematic for you. The riparian zone is the zone of vegetation between the water's edge and the drier upland area. In some cases, that might extend from one side of a valley floor to the other. In other cases, like that headwater stream channel that I showed you, it might be just a matter of a foot or two. Riparian zones are really very important places on the landscape. They can help us out by reducing erosion. Picture on the left side, you can see obviously that this bank, which is just turf grass, is falling apart. This is a Chautauqua County example. This is not uncharacteristic, this is very characteristic of what many of our streams look like. Once you take some binding out of them, they just fall apart. But interestingly enough, notice this. We have some stream shape considerations there, but by and large, this side is holding together, in my opinion, probably because there is woody vegetation there that has a good root mass binding that together. If this stuff is held together, and here's more homework for you. I'm sorry to load you up with all this homework, but I think you can get through it. As you drive out in your municipality, look for places like this. And then think about the floods that those places have been through. They've been exposed to the same kinds of floods as places like this. And yet you could barely tell there's been any impact there. It's because those riparian zones are doing their job. Unfortunately, we ripped a lot of that vegetation out when we were settling the landscape. We thought it was in the way. In my opinion, we need to put a lot of it back. Reduces erosion, filters pollutants, tremendously important for fish and wildlife habitat. If hunting and fishing are part of your economic drivers, if they're a piece of your puzzle, these riparian zones are really critical. I love this picture. Now, I have some colleagues that would immediately start to stomp their feet and say, well, that's not wide enough. You know what? I don't care. At this point, here's a trade-off that this farmer has made. He's going to dedicate some land to serve that riparian function. What he gets in exchange for that is he's got some reliability. He knows his farm field is not going to look like this. He's not going to lose that income year after year after year. I think it's a fantastic trade-off. We can talk about, some of the other details later, but to me, this is fantastic. So it helps the farmer and it helps the community because it keeps the tax base viable. So it's a really important thing that a riparian zone can help to do. Floodplains are just those land surfaces when this stream comes up under those flood events. It's the place where it can spread out and dissipate some energy. Historically, we didn't really like that because we settled the floodplains. We put a lot of people built on floodplains, we put infrastructure on floodplains, and then it got wiped out. We thought, well, maybe if we straighten the stream channel and dig it deeper, that'll help. It was well intended, but in most cases, I would argue that if that stream channel cannot come up and out of its banks, all that energy is going to stay in the stream, and it's going to go down and out. And so what you have started is a process of degradation of that stream channel. Your floods are going to get worse and worse and worse. And your stream channel function is going to get worse and worse and worse. It's going to change. Reduces stream energy, absorbs it, slowly releases it back at the time of year when you really want it back. You want it in the summer. You want that water supply to be there in the stream in the summer. You want it there year round, but that's a critical time that we often lose our streams. So here's our tale of two floodplains. You can see this looks fairly functional from what I've said already. This one looks less functional. And the reality is there are people and municipalities all over New York State that are in this position that are going to experience significant losses. That's not a callous statement, it's understanding how the funnel works. And by the way, if our funnels are still developing, if we're still changing the structure and the texture of that funnel, if we're putting more slides in the upper part of the watershed, and you live now in the lower part where we see these floodplains, you can expect the impacts from floods to get worse and worse and worse. That is not accounting for changes in precipitation patterns. That's just talking about the stuff we're dealing with now. So really thinking about that watershed context is important, and floodplains are important. Now, watershed plumbing. When you think about how long we've been on the landscape, the mantra pretty much was from day one, get the water off, right? We've seen it, we see it across New York State. Get the water off as quickly as possible. And of course, we have to get the water off in some places. We have road ditches, we have infrastructure, we have all kinds of things out there, and we have a lot of water in New York State. So what we have done typically and historically is we routed that water, we took a lot of surface water, we transformed it into, we took subsurface water that was in the soil, we transformed it to surface water, and then we would send it screaming down the hill in our road ditches. You can't see it here, but there's a stream right here. It's picking up this water, it's picking up this water. In Chautauqua County in western New York, we have a lot of agricultural drain tiles. So we have a pattern, a history of giving our highway folks all our water from our private land. You guys deal with it, right? You guys know. You deal with it. I've been asking this question for the last few years. How much of the water in your road ditch would you estimate is really road drainage water, which is what your ditch was designed for? Want to take a stab? Less than a quarter. That's what I typically hear. Think about that number. And think about the job these guys have. I have a lot of respect for you guys because you're trying to deal with all that water that everybody has said, you know what, we'll just give it to the town. You take our water, you deal with it. So what have you been done? What tools do you have? Well, you can dig a ditch. That's pretty much the tool you got by the time you're at the roadside. If your ditch happens to connect to the stream, you've got direct conveyance. You've got a slide. Again, that's not being critical of our highway folks. They inherited this situation, and they inherited a culture and a mentality that said it was okay to just give your water to the town and let them deal with it. Maybe we don't want to do that anymore. Here you can see culvert. We've got a discharge. I mentioned water quantity, which I think these two slides illustrate. Also water quality. A lot of our water quality issues are generated in the ditch because our ditches are carrying more water than they really should be carrying. So we have this ripple effect. Let's talk about some changes in time and space. Is anybody keeping track of my time, by the way? A little faster. Okay, we're going to put it on whirlwind mode here. Time and space, somebody asked this question. Have you seen changes over time? Let me take you back over to Western New York. Here's what Lakewood looked like in 1938, 2004. This is Chautauqua Lake that you see here, and this is just an artifact of the air photo. It's not really the condition of Chautauqua Lake. But I will say this. The forefathers never stood on the hills and said, how can we degrade conditions in Chautauqua Lake? But because they didn't understand a lot about watershed management, a lot of our actions have done just that. And I'm sure your municipalities really are no different, whether you drain to a lake or whether you drain to a stream or wherever you go. You don't have to have a lake to have an important watershed, by the way. Let's talk just a little bit about cumulative effects. Developer rolls into town. They said, we got a great project. We're going to build your tax base. 20 new homes in the same watershed. You've got a beautiful watershed here just begging for home construction. We're going to put them all in. When can we start? No, it doesn't work that way, right? Triggers seeker. The state's going to require a stormwater pollution prevention plan. You'll probably have some discussions at the municipal level about some other considerations. In our part of the world, at least, more typical is this. We already start with 10 homes that have been there forever. They have some friends. The friends say, hey, you live in a beautiful place. I think we want to build a home. 3 more move in, all in the same watershed. Triggers nothing. Few more years, few more homes, 4 more. Now we're 7. Nothing. A little later, 3 more. From a watershed standpoint, it's acting exactly like the development. Except there has been no discussion of how to manage stormwater. There's been no discussion of other impacts, how it's going to relate to the road system, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe there's been some municipal discussions. Typically the municipal discussions, and I mean no disrespect like this, by this, but typically what I hear is the municipal discussions are very engaged with the tax base. But you're really cutting your own throat if you're not thinking about some of these other considerations. Eventually, all that water, whether it's naturally caused or human caused, it plays out at the other end of the watershed, and the watershed has to process it, regardless of where it came from. And it will do that, as Mr. Griffin's example pointed out. We have a lot of inherent and changed factors. I just want to point out that a lot of our changes were done with good intentions, but they're kind of eating our lunch right now, in my opinion. We have an opportunity to change some of these things back, but we might have to think of some creative ways of doing that. This is a municipal cost example. It's a small but significant example. Highway superintendent took me out a few years ago. He told me that there was a couple hundred feet of road ditch here. They rebuilt it 5 times. In 3 years, it cost them about $15,000. They put in these concrete kind of check dams. They keyed them in. They put fabric and then limestone in their ditches. They were able to stabilize it, and they didn't have to go back to it for 4 years. So there are cumulative effects in terms of municipal benefits as well as municipal costs. And this may not look like a whole lot, but you start adding these up throughout your municipality to your 10% grade road segments, you might be able to save a lot of money for a few years. Yes, you will have to go back and do some work on it, no doubt about that. But it's better than putting money into it multiple times in the same year. There are 8 tools of watershed protection. I want to put a plug in for the Center for Watershed Protection. They work with a lot of municipalities across the country. I've modified this, 8 tools of watershed investment, I call it. I'll bang through these quickly. If you didn't know what a watershed was yesterday, you do today, and you will tomorrow. So maybe watershed planning is something to consider. The parts of the landscape that are currently functional or in a more functional condition, oftentimes on private lands, you want those sponges to stay sponges. So if you can incentivize that, for private landowners in any way, if you can make them aware of their contribution to the puzzle and make them feel good about what they're doing. It doesn't really pay to put a finger in somebody's chest, this is what I've found. But if you can work with them, they can work for you. Better site design are some ways to develop that are consistent and compatible with the functions that I've been talking about. And there's some really neat stuff out there, which is very attractive, by the way. If you want to talk about tax base, you develop in a way that is more sustainable and more functional. It also is much more attractive and contributes to your tax base. Stormwater management, erosion control, these are things that need to be thought of before your project goes in. They need to be installed at the right time in the right place, and then they do need to be maintained. All three of those. Non-stormwater discharges, these are typically water quality things. They might be from my septic tank. They might be from the hobby farm down the road. Just primarily things that are going on every little day, but it all adds up. Watershed stewardship is a job that we have traditionally given to the watershed groups, right? Or to the green people. That's their job. And that's the job we've given them. I don't believe that anymore. I think we're all watershed stewards. If we understand what a watershed is, we all have a place in it. We all have a role in it. So I come back to this question. Typically, in most of the municipalities where I present, they don't have anybody in charge of watershed management, and therefore they have nobody in charge of watershed management. I would argue that it's the job of everybody, as I mentioned in the last slide. We haven't really been thinking about our world in this way, but it might be one of the things that we have to do in the future. I'm embarrassed to say, but I guess I have to use this as a lesson learned. This is on my own property. I had a drainage ditch that went sour on me last year, as Jeff gave me a new term. It blew out the end. It blew out this hill slope. We had some pretty intense storms in Chautauqua County following some pretty deep freezes, and I had a problem on my own property. The benefit for me has been that when I typically give these presentations, everybody goes like this. Nobody's got a problem. It's always somebody else. Well, I'm going to tell you here today, I'm part of the problem. This presentation is not about pointing fingers. It's about realizing that we all are part of the solution as well. And it's coming with some heavy costs and some lessons learned, but they're important lessons and we can learn from each other. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. Understanding how flooding works maybe can prevent a situation like this. Again, your three homework symbols: the funnel, the sponge, and the slide. What do you have in your watershed? Thank you.